Okay, this is impactful accessibility, the changes that mean the most. So a little about me to get started. I'm an accessibility engineer. I'm a former technology evangelist and a full stack web developer. I have multiple disabilities that actually make using the web a little difficult. And I have an MA in International Peace and Conflict Resolution, which means I've done like a lot of studying of how people's worlds affect how they interact with other things. And you can find me at Tech Evangelista on Twitter. I also added a bunch of puppy pictures to my slides like just now because I felt bad for not having more puppy representation. So, he's a little sleepy because I'm on Benadryl. About this talk. This is not really an intro to accessibility talk. I'm not going to be going over what a disability is, what alternative input and outputs are, or anything like that. It's pretty easy to find online. There's tons of intro talks around. I've given them. But even if you don't have a background in this, there should be a lot of things that you can understand and take away from this talk. I've also tried to focus on the parts of accessibility that developers actually have some say in, because there's some things that you need a designer to be willing to work on, like color contrast, or you need a product owner to agree on. And I have a page with these exact slides, like just a link to this Google slide presentation, and a bunch of resources on disability and accessibility at Dragun with a U, like my last name, .tech/JSConf Hawaii. And just a disclaimer before we get started, this talk is not the end-all, be-all of accessibility. Obviously, it's like 25 minutes long. I had to cut out 3 sections. It's not a lot. Even if you do everything I talk about here, if you do nothing else for accessibility, you'll probably still have bad accessibility. And what is or isn't good accessibility is also very dependent on your site and your users. Even things like WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are the standards a lot of government uses, can be wrong for your specific use case. Users, especially disabled users, obviously have a variety of needs that you might not think about at first. Probably one of the biggest issues for accessibility on the web is giving users the information they need, right? So for example, you as a developer probably shouldn't be writing the alt attributes on your images. It's copy. Unless you're writing other copy, you probably shouldn't be doing this. But let's say that you have to, because you probably do. I'm going to do like a brief exercise to get you into that mindset. This is a picture of my puppy Colby, who's on a bed playing with a toy. And I want you to study this for a few seconds and think about what the relevant information in the picture is. Okay, so the problem is that depending on what your site is doing, what is relevant is completely different. If you're doing a dog adoption site, and you need alt text for this picture, you're going to focus on the details about the puppy. You're going to say maybe a long-haired miniature dachshund puppy of 14 weeks plays by himself inside or something like that. And then for the dog story, you're going to focus on the toy. You don't really care so much about the puppy. You can be like, small breed puppy plays indoors with our rainbow puzzle toy, or something like that. And it's going to be a completely different mindset depending on who your audience is. Because alt text is very dependent on that sort of thing. It's supposed to be what your users would get from that image if they could actually see it. You should also make sure not to use words like image. I didn't use it in my little examples there because screen readers actually say image. So what you end up doing is like image, image of a puppy, image, image of a toy, over and over again, and it gets really annoying. And also a note, there's a big debate over what is trivial images or not. If you're doing alt text, you need to remember that there are people who have low vision who are also using a screen reader, so they know that something's there, but if you remove it from the screen reader's like ability to tell them that, you're going to have people really frustrated because there's like this spot on the page that they just don't know what it is. Complementing alt text is long description. So if you have an infographic, like this one I took from the web accessibility site, DQ, or you have a chart like this pie graph I made last night using Excel, a long description gives a way to fully describe these. All that information needs to be accessed by people and who can't see it or maybe can't understand it in the format it's in. And I thought it was appropriate to have a docs one for this one. A long description can be accessed through like placing a link next to the image or by providing a link using what's called long desc attribute, like description but cut off, because all of these things are really obvious. And there's other options, like the infographic that I showed just has the page after it, have the text from the infographic. And charts, it's highly recommended to have a table with that same data, like right with the chart, so people can figure out what's going on. And I did some web stuff during the 90s. I know tables aren't really like a thing people want to think about, but this is actually tablature data, so it's actually the point where you'd use a table. Which, of course, brings up this idea of like semantic markup in general, which can be very accessible on its own, right? Sometimes using HTML is just better accessibility than CSS, naturally. So when some people use spans or classes to change how the letters or words look on a page, that means that screen readers can't really access that. So if it's not just purely for design, if you're actually trying to get across something, like say you're emphasizing a word, well, if you use CSS instead of like the EM markup, the screen readers can completely miss that. Another thing is using HTML properly. Like, how can there be two main sections on a page? Or like, why would an H4 heading come before you even see an H2? Screen readers and also web scrapers, which are like search engines, are relying heavily on the structure of the HTML document. So it's really important to have actual proper structure. And you shouldn't just use semantic markup, but use the right HTML, right? Don't just make something look like something else. This is common with checkboxes, lists, buttons. Colby likes to pretend he's a bagel, all different things. So like, usually it just makes it harder for screen readers and can also make it harder for others depending on how their browser add-ons or phones treat the elements. On my phone, I have a option turned on to make the buttons like way more obvious. It puts an outline around them, it gives me a little more space to press them, but it works for buttons, not for divs that are used like buttons. And like, buttons are not just for forms. Buttons are actually really great. They do things, and people know they do things, and they're announced by screen readers as buttons. So if you're looking to do something on a page, you might just be skimming for a button. If you're going to do something that like triggers when a user presses something, the button's generally your best option. And along with buttons, you want to make sure you're giving like all the proper information, right? It's the whole, I don't want to just style something with CSS and have it actually have meaning. If you disable a button, if you make it say like really faded out or flat when your other buttons aren't, to tell people, hey, you can't use this button, you also need to use the attribute that will let other people who can't see the button know that. Which leads into what's called ARIA, which is like markup, like extra information in your markup to give to your screen readers. It's basically can give screen readers information about the visual aspects of the page, about steps in a process, even about changes made on the page. So like your login screen, maybe the only change you do when something goes wrong is you put some red text at the beginning to tell them that their information's wrong. Well, ARIA lets people know, hey, something changed. You can't see that red text. ARIA also gives you a way to turn that div into a button as far as your technology is concerned. You can give it the role of button, and then it will be treated more like that. And for whatever reason you wanted that div instead of a button, you can have it. It also provides alt text equivalents, right? So this is really good for anything where it might be ambiguous, like say you have a button that has an X because it's going to close something. So you can tell people, hey, ARIA label close. This isn't just a random X sitting on your page. You can use this. But of course, like it has its downsides. The one thing everyone who uses screen readers tells me about ARIA is that the worst thing than underuse is overuse. Some things do not need labels. Some things don't need alerts. And for some of this stuff, it has no character limit. So you could really just take an icon of a house and explain it in details for paragraphs when all anyone really wants to know is it's the home button. The W3C who made WCAG itself says that no ARIA is better than bad ARIA because you could end up overriding actually good accessibility by using bad ARIA, which is hard to imagine, but browsers actually have some pretty good defaults going on that you can take advantage of. So if you don't have a designer giving you any specifics or you don't have a designer at all and you're not sure what to do, falling back on the browser defaults is actually not only just easy, but it can be better, right? They have a focus state indicator. That's when you keyboard navigate into a page with your tab and it gives an outline around something. They have cursor behavior, button appearance, and all of that is something that people are familiar with who use these options. Just like seeing an underlined link seems familiar to most people. And not only do browsers have defaults, but there's also a way that users can set them to perform better for them in certain ways and have it affect every page they go to, such as minimum font size. So font size is obviously kind of important for how people read your page, but even if you have a reasonable font size, it can also not be enough for people. So they set a setting in the accessibility options in their browsers to never go below a certain font size, which of course there's some horrific CSS properties that allow people to keep the font very small, which keeps people from being able to read the site because overriding the minimum can cause it to just be unreadable. There's also choices that you can make in the CSS and HTML that can mean that if that text expands, it gets hidden by another element or goes off the page, meaning that people miss out on information that you don't allow for your page's font size to grow. So try to make sure your users have the information they need in a format they can read it in. Whether that's adding more code or leaving it out, whether it's communicating directly with a screen reader or creating something any user can access, it's really an important step. But also, in order to get that information, they actually have to navigate to it. So with accessibility-specific methods like a skip menu link, sometimes called a skip to main content link, they can do that really easier. So what is that? It's like an internal link at the top of the page that gives people the choice to skip navigation. Like say the really hardcore Amazon nav, that's a bunch of menus, it's a bunch of buttons, it's just really complicated. So when you tab into the Amazon website, they actually have a skip to main content link that just lets you skip all that. So if possible, have it always visible, but most people don't. If you have designers working on this who agree to do a skip content link, they'll probably want it to disappear when people lose focus of it. So make sure that people can get back to it and it will be visible again. Also make sure it appears really high up in your page so that they don't have to go through half your menu in order to skip the last half of your menu. Most people who are familiar with this are also used to the language of it, so something like skip to main content is really familiar to them, and you probably shouldn't mess too much with the wording. Search bars, which we don't really think of as an accessibility need, are actually a very similar deal. People will just go straight to the search bar instead of messing around with your navigation. They'll type in what they need to search for, and they'll go to it right away. This is the same deal. You want it to be early, you want it to be noticeable. You definitely want a keyboard to be able to get to it and use it. And you definitely don't want it to disappear. I think probably all of us have had experience where something we hover over needs to be the cursor needs to be in the exact right spot in order to have it stay up. And that's really bad for a lot of people. Another one that people really don't think much of is sitemaps. So there's not much to add to it. It's you normally auto-generate it and shove a link in the footer, right? But some people actually just use this to navigate your site. They don't know exactly what they're searching for, or if they're you don't have a search, they might use your sitemap. You want it in the footer, you want it to be called sitemap, you don't want to do some cutesy thing with it. And you want to make sure people can navigate to it. So if you have something like infinite scroll and people never access your footer, that's not accessible. And there's special features that you add that can go beyond the basic site that you might be implementing that are big headaches for literally everyone involved, like modals. So there's two main issues with modals for accessibility that everyone talks about. And the first is what we call a reverse keyboard trap. And it's when a modal pops up and the person's on the page behind it, and they're keyboard navigating, or they're using something similar to that, and they cannot get to your modal. The two ways to solve this, the easiest two ways to solve this are to just put the modal code physically with the trigger. It should be the next code in your page, so people just go naturally to it. But also, there's a JavaScript answer, and it's the really hard to think of focus method that you just use to pass focus to something. And the second way is exiting. So probably even if you don't have accessibility needs, you've experienced a modal that you cannot get rid of. And it's especially bad if you don't have a mouse or if you don't have fine motor control to get a tiny little button somewhere. So the main way to do this is you should have an event listener for the escape key. And you should also have that X button we mentioned earlier for closing things somewhere on the top, which should be one of the first things people hit. And if you can, having an exit button at the end is very good too, so people don't have to go back and forth to different buttons to get out of that modal. And remember mobile users, because that's where people have the most problem with it. And that's where a modal popping up that they can't close will just generally make people shift to a different site and just not come back to yours. So users must be able to navigate to the information they need and be able to perceive how to navigate to. So what's the general takeaway from this? Users navigating websites to access information is basically what the web is for. There are many ways to make that better for people with accessibility needs. As a developer, you have some say in what you do with the code you're writing, right? Maybe you can't change the colors. Maybe you can't stop autoplay from happening. But you can make some decisions, and by working in areas that will never even affect the design of the page, you can improve the usability of it. by adding a little accessibility, you can make a stressful process, which for some people is going to be like nearly every website they go to, easier on your users. Yeah, thank you.